Richard Kuklinski sat in his Lincoln Continental, adjusting the rearview mirror. 3 egg sandwiches lay on the passenger seat. One contained enough cyanide to kill 5 men in under 30 seconds. In 20 minutes, he planned to feed it to a stranger, watch him die, and split $80,000 with his partner. What Kuklinski didn't know was that 50 federal agents surrounded the truck stop. What he didn't know was that his partner was an undercover ATF agent who'd spent 18 months recording every word he said. What he didn't know was that in the next hour, his double life as America's most brutal contract killer would finally end. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For 30 years, Richard Kuklinski had been the mob's most valuable asset. He'd killed for the Gambinos, the Genovese, the Lucchese families, freelancing murder to whoever paid the highest price. He claimed to have killed over 200 people using guns, knives, crossbows, car bombs, and his signature weapon, pure cyanide, that could drop a man instantly without a sound. But Richard Kuklinski wasn't just a killer. He was a devoted father who coached Little League, a loving husband who took his family to Disney World, a suburban neighbor who helped jumpstart cars and shovel driveways. For 3 decades, he lived a perfect double life, until someone decided to bring it all crashing down. This is the story of the Iceman, the contract killer who horrified even the Mafia with his methods. But here's what makes this different from every other organized crime story. Kuklinski's downfall didn't come from greed or betrayal. It came from his own mouth, recorded by an FBI agent so deep undercover that he nearly became the next victim. From a childhood of unthinkable abuse to becoming the most feared freelance killer in America, this is how Richard Kuklinski built a career on murder while hiding in plain sight, and how the most dangerous undercover operation in FBI history finally brought him down. April 11, 1935, Jersey City, New Jersey. 4th Street tenements. Richard Leonard Kuklinski was born into a house of horrors. His father, Stanley, was a Polish immigrant railroad worker who drank Boilermakers, whiskey with beer chasers, and used his Garrison belt as a weapon. Stanley would wrap the heavy leather belt around his knuckles and punch his children in the head until they lost consciousness. Richard's mother, Anna, had once dreamed of becoming a nun. Instead, she found herself trapped in a marriage to a violent alcoholic. She dealt with the terror by turning violent herself, beating her children with broom handles and telling them God wanted them to suffer. The house was a war zone. Stanley would come home drunk and rage through the small apartment, smashing furniture and attacking anyone in reach. Anna would face the wall and pray silently while her husband destroyed everything around her. The children learned to hide, to disappear, to become invisible when the violence started. Richard's older brother, Florian, tried to protect the younger kids. He was gentle, fragile, everything Stanley despised. In 1941, when Richard was 5, Stanley came home particularly drunk and began beating Florian with his belt-wrapped fist. He hit the boy in the back of the head repeatedly, each blow like a sledgehammer. Florian collapsed. He never got back up. Stanley had murdered his own son. Panicking, Stanley forced Anna to call the hospital and report that Florian had fallen down the stairs. The authorities never questioned the story. Florian was laid out in the family's living room, just blocks from the church where Stanley and Anna had been married. Richard stared at his brother's body in the cheap wooden coffin, not understanding death, only knowing that Florian would never protect him again. After killing Florian, Stanley abandoned the family completely. He simply disappeared one day, leaving Anna alone with the surviving children. But the violence didn't stop. It escalated. Anna convinced herself that her children needed harsh discipline to survive in a brutal world. She beat them with household objects, screaming that it was God's will. Richard, now the oldest surviving child, became the primary target of his mother's rage. He was small for his age, pale, with nervous energy that made him an easy mark for neighborhood bullies. The abuse at home combined with constant torment on the streets created something dangerous inside the boy, a capacity for violence that would eventually horrify the world. To cope with the powerlessness, young Richard began torturing animals. He'd catch neighborhood cats, tie their tails together, and throw them over clotheslines to watch them tear each other apart. He'd set dogs on fire and watch them burn to death. The screams of dying animals were the only sounds that made him feel powerful in a world where he was always the victim. 1948, Jersey City. Richard was 13. Charlie Lane was the leader of a teenage gang called the Project Boys. For months, he'd been hunting Richard through the neighborhood, beating him publicly to establish his reputation. Richard endured it because he had no choice. Lane was bigger, stronger, and had backup. But something changed in Richard that year. Maybe it was growing taller, gaining weight. Maybe it was watching his brother die and learning that violence was the only language that mattered. Whatever happened, Richard made a decision that would define the rest of his life. One afternoon, Richard armed himself with a thick wooden dowel and waited in an alley where he knew Lane would pass. When the gang leader appeared, Richard attacked with 3 years of accumulated rage. He beat Charlie Lane to death, continuing to swing the dowel long after the boys stopped moving. Standing over the corpse, 13-year-old Richard Kuklinski felt something he'd never experienced before: complete control. He'd eliminated a problem permanently, and it felt good. But Richard wasn't finished. Instinctively understanding the need to cover his tracks, he dragged the body to his father's tool shed. Using a hatchet, he cut off Charlie's fingertips. With pliers, he pulled out every tooth. Then he loaded the mutilated corpse into a stolen car and drove to a bridge in South Jersey, where he dumped the body into the water. At 13 years old, Richard Kuklinski had committed the perfect murder. The 1,950 seconds brought new opportunities for violence. Richard dropped out of school at 16. But what was the point? The streets taught him everything he needed to know. He was now 6'2" and weighed 250 pounds. His childhood frailness replaced by an imposing physical presence that made people step aside when he walked down the street. Richard fell in with truck hijacking crews, pulling scores on the New Jersey Turnpike. While other criminals spent their money on cars and women, Richard saved every dollar. He understood that crime was a business, and he was developing a specialty that would make him incredibly valuable: killing without hesitation or remorse. Richard's reputation as someone who would handle problems spread through the Newark underworld. When bookies couldn't collect debts, they called Richard. When business partners needed to be permanently removed, Richard got the contract. He was reliable, efficient, and completely without conscience. In 1961, Richard met Barbara Pedrici at a warehouse where he worked during the day. Barbara was 18, innocent, with no idea what her new boyfriend did for a living. When she became pregnant, Richard married her. It was the beginning of the most elaborate double life in criminal history. To Barbara and eventually their 3 children, Richard was a devoted family man who worked in foreign exchange and traveled frequently for business. He coached Little League Baseball for his son Chris. He attended every parent-teacher conference. He took the family to Disney World and never missed a birthday or Christmas. But at night, Richard became something else entirely. 1963, Brooklyn. Roy DeMeo's Auto Body Shop. Roy DeMeo was a Gambino family soldier who would eventually run the most efficient murder operation in mob history. The DeMeo crew killed over 100 people, using what became known as the Gemini method, luring victims to the Gemini Lounge, shooting them immediately upon entry, draining their blood, and dismembering their bodies for disposal across multiple landfills. When DeMeo met Richard Kuklinski, he recognized something special. Here was a man who stood 6'5" and weighed 300 pounds, with dead eyes that showed no fear and no conscience. More importantly, he wasn't Italian, which meant he could move freely through areas where known mobsters would be spotted immediately. DeMeo became Richard's mentor in professional murder. He taught him that killing could be incredibly profitable: $5,000 for a troublesome union leader, $10,000 for a rival gangster, $25,000 for a government witness. He showed Richard how to use different weapons for different situations, how to make bodies disappear completely, and most importantly, how to compartmentalize violence as a business transaction. "You're not killing people," DeMeo told Richard. "You're solving problems." Under DeMeo's tutelage, Richard learned to kill with guns, knives, crossbows, and his hands. He learned about poisons. Cyanide was particularly effective because it killed quickly and left minimal forensic evidence. He learned about explosives, how to build car bombs that would detonate on ignition. But Richard's signature innovation was freezing victims' bodies to confuse time of death. He'd learned the technique from a criminal nicknamed Mr. Frosty, who used commercial freezers to store corpses for months before disposal. By keeping bodies frozen and then thawing them before dumping, Richard could destroy alibis and make it impossible for investigators to establish when murders actually occurred. The technique earned him his nickname, the Iceman. Between 1963 and 1980, Richard Kuklinski became organized crime's most valuable freelance asset. He worked for all 5 New York crime families: Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno. He also took contracts from smaller New Jersey crews and even individual criminals who needed problems eliminated. Richard's methods were diverse and horrifying. He preferred cyanide because it was quiet, not messy, not noisy. Victims would simply collapse and die within seconds. He could administer the poison through contaminated food, aerosol sprays, or direct skin contact. He once killed a man by walking past him on a crowded street and spraying cyanide mist in his face. For more dramatic statements, Richard used explosives. Car bombs were his specialty. He'd wire the ignition so the target would die the moment they started their engine. The explosion would destroy evidence while sending a clear message to anyone else considering crossing his employers. But Richard's most chilling murders were personal. When someone truly angered him, he would make them suffer. He'd use ice picks to puncture organs slowly, keeping victims alive for hours. He'd strangle people with piano wire, applying just enough pressure to cause agony without killing quickly. These weren't professional hits. They were torture sessions that satisfied Richard's need to inflict maximum pain. The money was extraordinary. By 1975, Richard was earning $65,000 per hit, equivalent to over $300,000 today. He was the highest paid freelance killer in America, and crime families across the East Coast competed for his services. Richard invested his murder money carefully. He bought real estate, legitimate businesses, and expensive cars. But he lived modestly to avoid attracting attention. To his neighbors in suburban Dumont, New Jersey, he was just Richard, the quiet businessman who traveled frequently and loved his family. But the double life was taking its toll. Barbara Kuklinski later described her husband as having 2 distinct personalities: Good Richie and Bad Richie. Good Richie was the loving father who read bedtime stories and helped with homework. Bad Richie appeared without warning, violent, unpredictable, and terrifying. During his rages, Richard would smash furniture, punch holes in walls, and threaten his family. He was physically abusive to Barbara, breaking her nose multiple times and once trying to run her over with his car. The violence caused her to suffer several miscarriages. But according to Barbara, Richard never laid a hand on their children because she threatened to kill him if he did. Even in his madness, Richard understood that harming his kids would cross a line he couldn't return from. His children were the only innocent things in his life, and protecting them was the last vestige of his humanity. January 30th, 1980. Jersey City, New Jersey. George Maliband was a 300-pound fence who moved stolen goods through Newark's underground markets. He was also a problem. Maliband owed Richard $50,000 from various deals and had begun telling people that Richard was just another tough guy who could be ignored. Richard called Maliband and arranged a meeting to discuss the debt. They met at a warehouse where Maliband stored stolen electronics. The conversation was brief. When Maliband refused to pay and threatened to tell stories about Richard's business, Richard pulled out a .38 revolver and shot him 5 times in the chest. The 300-pound corpse was too big for Richard's usual disposal methods. He found a 55-gallon drum and began stuffing Maliband's body inside. When the corpse wouldn't fit, Richard used a knife to cut the tendons in Maliband's legs, folding them at impossible angles until the body compressed enough to seal the drum. Richard dumped the barrel near a chemical plant in Jersey City, figuring the industrial pollution would mask any forensic evidence. He was wrong. A week later, workers discovered the drum and called police. For the first time in his career, Richard Kuklinski had left evidence that could be traced back to him. Maliband's brother told investigators that George had been meeting with a large, bearded man on the day he disappeared, a description that matched Richard perfectly. The Maliband murder marked the beginning of Richard's downfall, but it would take 6 more years to catch him. Detective Pat Kane of the New Jersey State Police began connecting dots. Kane was investigating a string of disappearances involving men connected to stolen goods operations. All had last been seen with a large man who drove expensive cars, but dressed modestly. Kane started building a file on Richard Kuklinski. He connected him to 5 missing persons cases: George Maliband, Louis Masque, Paul Hoffman, Gary Smith, and Daniel Deppner. All had been involved in criminal enterprises. All had vanished after meeting Richard, and the few bodies that were found showed evidence of exotic murder methods. But Kane had no direct evidence. Richard was too careful, too experienced. He'd been killing for 20 years without leaving witnesses or forensic proof. Kane needed someone to get close to Richard, to record him confessing to murders. Enter Dominic Polifrone. ATF Special Agent Dominic Polifrone was a legend in undercover work. He'd successfully infiltrated all 5 New York crime families by posing as various types of criminals: drug dealers, arms smugglers, and even hitmen. For his most dangerous assignment yet, he would become Dominic Provenzano, a mid-level criminal looking to expand his operations. The challenge was enormous. Richard Kuklinski had survived 30 years in organized crime by trusting no one completely. He was naturally suspicious and had killed dozens of people for far less than attempting to infiltrate his operations. One mistake, one inconsistency in Polifrone's cover story, and he'd end up in pieces scattered across New Jersey. September 1985. Operation Iceman begins. Polifrone's entry point was Phil Solomene's storefront in Paterson, New Jersey. Solomene was an old friend of Richard's who'd agreed to cooperate with authorities after being arrested on weapons charges. The storefront looked legitimate but served as a meeting place for criminals to plan scores and fence stolen goods. For months, Polifrone hung around the storefront, establishing his credibility with local criminals. He claimed to have connections for moving large quantities of cocaine and purchasing military weapons. Richard, who was always interested in new business opportunities, eventually agreed to meet this Dominic Provenzano. December 1985. Dunkin' Donuts, Dumont, New Jersey. Their first meeting nearly ended in disaster. Richard arrived 20 minutes late, a tactical move to see if Polifrone was being surveilled. Polifrone sat alone, wearing a wire and carrying a concealed .380 pistol. He'd been given permission to kill Richard if the situation turned violent. Richard was immediately suspicious. He asked probing questions about Polifrone's background, his connections, his business operations. But Polifrone had prepared for months. His cover story was perfect. He was a career criminal from Bergen County with a documented arrest record for drug trafficking and weapons violations. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. During their conversation, Polifrone casually mentioned he was looking for a reliable source of pure cyanide for a job he was planning. Richard's eyes lit up. He could provide cyanide, he said, but he needs something in return, a silencer-equipped pistol for his own work. They exchanged phone numbers and agreed to meet again. The hook was set. For the next 18 months, Polifrone walked a tightrope between death and discovery. He met with Richard dozens of times, always in public places, truck stops, diners, parking lots. Richard remained cautious, but gradually began to trust Dominic Provenzano. Polifrone played his role perfectly. He never pressed Richard for information. Instead, he let Richard talk, encouraging him with questions about technique and methodology. Richard, who took pride in his expertise, began describing his murders in chilling detail. "It's quiet, it's not messy, it's not noisy," Richard explained about cyanide poisoning. "There are even spray mists around. You spray it in somebody's face, and they go to sleep." Richard demonstrated different delivery methods: aerosol bottles, contaminated food, direct skin contact. He described his freezing techniques, explaining how storing bodies in commercial freezers confused time of death and destroyed alibis. Most shockingly, Richard began confessing to specific murders. He admitted killing Roy DeMeo, his former mentor, after DeMeo became a liability. He described torturing victims with ice picks and piano wire. He boasted about his body count, claiming to have killed over 100 people. But Polifrone needed more than confessions. He needed Richard to commit a crime on tape. The plan they developed was simple and horrific. They would murder a rich kid who was coming to buy cocaine from Polifrone. Richard would provide cyanide-poisoned food. They'd feed it to the victim, watch him die, and split $80,000 from the sale. Richard was excited about the score. Easy money with no complications. He agreed to provide 3 egg sandwiches, one laced with enough cyanide to kill 5 men. The meeting was set for December 17th, 1986, at the Vince Lombardi truck stop. December 17th, 1986, 6:47 p.m. The trap closes. Richard arrived at the truck stop carrying 3 egg sandwiches and a bottle of what he believed was pure cyanide. The FBI lab had substituted the poison with quinine, a harmless but bitter compound. They knew Richard would test the poison before using it. Richard found a stray dog near the truck stop and fed it a hamburger laced with the fake cyanide. When the dog didn't die, Richard became suspicious. He told Polifrone something was wrong with the poison, and they'd have to postpone the hit. "I gotta check on something at home," Richard said, getting into his Lincoln Continental. He never made it. 2 miles from his house, a joint task force of FBI agents, ATF officers, and New Jersey State Police surrounded his car. Richard offered no resistance. In his vehicle, they found the 3 sandwiches, one prepared to murder an innocent man. The arrest of Richard Kuklinski marked the end of the most prolific contract-killing career in American history. But prosecuting him would be nearly impossible without Polifrone's recordings. Richard was too careful, too experienced. He'd spent 23 years killing without leaving witnesses or forensic evidence. The trial began in March, 1988 inches. Hackensack, New Jersey. For weeks, prosecutors played secretly recorded conversations between Richard and Polifrone. Jurors listened in horror as Richard calmly described murder techniques, boasted about his victim count, and planned new killings. The most damaging evidence was Richard's own voice, describing the murder of Gary Smith and Daniel Deppner, two associates he killed because they become liabilities. He explained how he'd poisoned Smith's hamburger with cyanide in a motel room, then stuffed the body under the bed. Smith's corpse wasn't discovered for 4 days. March 5, 1988. The verdict. Richard Kuklinski was found guilty of murdering Gary Smith and Daniel Deppner. The jury couldn't determine whether he'd personally administered the poison, so he escaped the death penalty. He was sentenced to consecutive life terms, making him ineligible for parole until he turned 110. Richard subsequently pleaded guilty to killing George Malaban and Louis Masgay in exchange for prosecutors dropping charges against his wife and son. Additional life sentences ensured he would never leave prison. The family Richard had killed to protect was destroyed by his arrest. Barbara Kuklinski divorced him, but continued visiting prison until her death. Their children struggled with the revelation that their loving father was America's most notorious hitman. Two wrote books about growing up with a serial killer, trying to reconcile the man who coached Little League with the monster who killed 200 people. In prison, Richard became obsessed with his legacy. He granted interviews to HBO documentarians, claiming responsibility for increasingly outrageous murders. He said he'd killed Jimmy Hoffa, Paul Castellano, and Carmine Galante, murders that had been solved and attributed to other killers. Law enforcement experts were skeptical of Richard's expanded claims. ATF agent Dominic Polifrone, who'd spent 18 months with him, believed Richard had killed no more than 15 people. The rest were lies designed to maintain his fearsome reputation behind bars. March 5, 2006. Street Francis Medical Center, Trenton, New Jersey. Richard Kuklinski died in a maximum security medical ward, officially from Kawasaki disease. He was 70 years old. The timing was suspicious. He was scheduled to testify the following week against Sammy, the Bull Gravano, potentially revealing secrets about unsolved murders. Some suspected Richard had been poisoned to prevent his testimony, but an autopsy found no evidence of foul play. The man who'd killed with every method imaginable died quietly in his sleep, taking his secrets with him. The legacy of Richard Kuklinski is a story about the compartmentalization of evil. For 30 years, he lived a perfect double life. Devoted family man by day, merciless killer by night. He'd attended his children's school plays hours after torturing victims to death. He'd coached Little League while planning multiple murders. Richard's case revealed how childhood trauma can create monsters. He'd learned to disconnect from violence as a 5-year-old, watching his father beat his brother to death. That same psychological defense mechanism, which had protected him as a child, transformed him into America's most prolific contract killer. But Richard's downfall also demonstrated the power of patient, methodical investigation. Detective Pat Kane spent 6 years building a case. Agent Dominic Polifrone risked his life for 18 months to gather evidence. Their persistence saved countless lives by removing the mob's most valuable asset from the streets. Today, the house where Richard Kuklinski raised his family stands unchanged in suburban Dumont, New Jersey. New owners have painted and landscaped, erasing all traces of its infamous former resident. Neighbors rarely mention that America's deadliest contract killer once lived among them, coaching their children and shoveling their driveways. The truth is almost impossible to believe. A man who killed 200 people while living as the perfect neighbor. But the recordings don't lie. Richard's own words provide the most chilling testimony to his crimes. "I've never felt sorry for anything I've done," he told HBO filmmakers, "other than hurting my family. But for the other stuff, no. It was due to business." That cold calculation explains how Richard Kuklinski could murder dozens of people while tucking his children into bed each night. He'd learned to disconnect from his actions as a child, and that disconnection allowed him to become something unrecognizable, a monster hiding in plain sight for 30 years. The Iceman melted away in a prison hospital, but the chill he cast over organized crime remains. His story proves that the most dangerous criminals aren't the flashy mobsters who make headlines. They're the quiet ones, the invisible ones, the ones who look exactly like everyone else. Richard Kuklinski lived among us for 70 years, and we never knew what he was capable of until it was too late for his victims. If you found this story compelling, hit subscribe. We drop a new organized crime documentary every week. And drop a comment. Which notorious criminals should we investigate next? The most dangerous ones are often the ones you've never heard of.